Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. My name is Ian Scott, and today we are going to spend some time talking about the E2 visa requirements, and in particular, the E2 visa requirements when cases are higher risk. And we're going to describe exactly what we mean by that as we go through the presentation. So a few things before we get started. As some of you may know, the firm was founded on an E2 visa 10 years ago. It's been 10 years. We've renewed once and we're going to renew again this year. And I am personally in the US on an E2 visa, so definitely happy to share my personal experience, both with respect to the application process and the renewal process with you. Scott Legal is a full service immigration firm, and we focus on E2 visas. We've processed hundreds of them at consulates all over the world. And in particular, we tend to focus on E2 visas that are higher risk. So cases with lower investment amount or other risk factors that we're going to describe during the presentation. In terms of webinars, we have at least 2 webinars a month, and this month I believe we have more than that, and we have webinars scheduled out through to April. So definitely take a look at our webinar series. One webinar that we have scheduled for next week that is of particular interest is the EB5 Direct webinar. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about during that webinar is the requirements for moving from an E2 visa to an EB5 Direct. And it's an opportune time to look at the EB5 Direct green card because the investment amount for that particular green card is lower than it will be probably in the future. So something to take a look at. I believe the date is February 2nd, but the actual information will be sent to you after the webinar. So in terms of the conclusion of the webinar, we're going to send you a number of pieces of information. One is the PowerPoint. So we are going to go through a PowerPoint presentation that we are going to send to you. We're also going to send you an E2 visa guide. This is a comprehensive guide that goes over the E2 visa requirements that you can use as a reference, where this particular webinar is actually being recorded as well. So we will send you a link to the recording, and we will also send you a link where you can sign up for the additional webinar. So when we send that link, you are going to have the information for not only the EB5 Direct webinar, but all of the other webinars that are scheduled. In terms of our panelists today, you have myself, Ian Scott. I'm the founder of the firm, and as I said, on an E2 visa myself. And we are honored to have Dustin Saldarriaga as well, who's an associate at the firm, who has a vast amount of knowledge with respect to processing E2 visas as well. In terms of questions, you can add questions to either the Q&A box or the chat box. We will get to all questions. We may not answer them just as you've asked them. I see a few people have asked some questions already. Certainly, we'll focus on the E2 questions first, and then if we have time after that, we'll answer questions about other visa categories that, as I said, if we have time to do that. And yeah, so without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Dustin to talk about the E2 visa requirements.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ian. And importantly, happy anniversary, happy 10-year anniversary on the firm. That's a wonderful accomplishment.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today to speak about what is, as Ian mentioned, kind of at the heart of our practice, which are E2 visas, in particular, where they present some unique challenges, typically in terms of a low investment amount. So to kick off the presentation, I'm going to run through, I'm going to take a step back and run through the requirements for the E2 visa. And then as the presentation continues, we'll talk about some of those specific challenges that come with, in particular, a low investment amount. So what are the E2 visa requirements for an E2 investor visa? The first requirement, which is really a threshold requirement, meaning that if you don't pass this requirement, you don't move on to the others, is that you must be a national of a treaty country. That means you need to hold the passport of an E2 treaty country, which is a country with which the United States has a trade treaty. The Department of State, the US Department of State, lists these countries on its website. As of now, I believe the count is more than 80 countries, and they are all over the world. So if you Google US Department of State E2 treaty countries, you'll get a long list of those countries that are E2 treaty countries. If you're a dual citizen, that's fine, as long as you're not a US citizen. If you hold the passport of an E2 treaty country, you do qualify and meet that nationality requirement. Second, you must own at least 50% of the E2 company if you are applying for an E2 investor visa. You need at least 50%. So you can be 50-50 owner with a co-owner. The moment that your ownership drops below 50%, you are disqualified from the E2 visa. So if you are granted an E2 visa, keep an eye on the ownership amount, particularly if you're in a high growth business where you're welcoming outside investors, for example. Third, you must actually make an investment in the company, and the investment needs to be at risk. That is language that the government uses in the regulations. And what at risk means is that the funds have actually been spent. In other words, it is not enough for your funds to be transferred to a business bank account and just sitting in that account where if you wanted, you could withdraw them and transfer them back to yourself. The government is going to want to see receipts, invoices, and proofs of payment, such as bank statements, showing that you've actually paid for the variety of things that are needed for your business. And we'll talk a lot more about this requirement, which really does take a large part of our focus as we prepare applications. The source of the funds that are invested in the business also need to be well documented. This is particularly true if you are within the US and you're applying for a change of status through US Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. USCIS will scrutinize where you got the money from that you're investing in the business. Consulates tend not to focus on this nearly as much as USCIS. So the burden is much less with consulates. It still exists, it's still a requirement, but in terms of what documents you need to provide, consulates will require much less than USCIS. And in terms of some particular sources of funds that we typically see, these can include personal savings from work, in which case you would provide your tax returns. It could be a gift that you receive from a family member, a friend, anyone really, as long as the gift is documented. And particularly if you're applying through USCIS, you would need to document how that person got the funds. Could be the sale of property. So if you sell an apartment, for example, and you can document that you received those funds and then invested that in the business, that's an appropriate source of funds. And it can be a loan, as long as the loan is not secured by the assets of the E2 business. The investment amount must be substantial. Again, that's a word that's used in the US regulations that define this visa. We'll talk a lot more about this, so I won't spend much time on it now, but in a couple slides, we'll talk more about it. Some typical E2 expenditures. When talking about this, you really want to show that you've bought the things that are needed for the business to be operational. And that's what the government's looking for. It's not just amount. It's not just about the amount you've spent. It's also what have you spent that amount on. As a good example, if you spend $1 million buying a piece of land that you expect to build your business on, and that's all you've spent is $1 million on a plot of land, the government likely will not find that to be sufficient, because the government's going to ask, well, there's a lot more you need to buy before this business is operational. Some of the things you would need: equipment for the business, you would need an actual office space, you would need an inventory if you're selling things, you need a website, you need office supplies, you might need to spend money on marketing, you might need to hire an independent contractor or even an employee to start developing some of the administrative aspects of the business. The government's really going to be looking for that. And if you're applying at a consulate, the question the government will have is everything in place such that if we grant you this visa, you're ready to show up in the US and really hit the ground running? And we see, to go to this last bullet, we see many people understandably are concerned about investing so much into a business, particularly if they're not even inside the US yet. How can they protect that investment in case the visa is denied? And the answer is an escrow account. An escrow account is really the only option that the government allows, where you can have a condition, which is issuance of the visa. That can be the one condition on which your funds are released. So you can put if you're buying a business, for example, this can make a lot of sense. A business, let's say you're paying $300,000. You don't want to spend that and then find out you've been denied the visa. So what you can do is put that amount in escrow, have an agreement with the business seller that the moment your visa is issued, the funds will be released. And if the visa is denied, the funds are returned to you. That is allowed by the US government. Let's move on to this fourth bullet. The business cannot be marginal. Marginal means that, as it's used by the government, is that the business must be able to support financially more than just the investor and their family. So the government wants to see that this is a business that will employ at least, we like to say at least 3 to 5 full-time US workers within 5 years of operations. A US worker is really anyone who's legally able to work in the US, whether a US citizen, permanent resident, or someone on a visa. Fifth requirement, the business must be real and operating. So it needs to actually, like I said before, it needs to be ready to operate upon issuance of the visa. It cannot just be theoretical. You cannot receive an E2 visa to come to the US and then start looking at businesses that you want to purchase. You need to have the business defined, and really it needs to be ready to start generating revenues as soon as you get the visa. And ways to show that the business is real and operating, or ready to be real and operating, are things like you see on the screen: a signed commercial lease, evidence that the business has been legally started, it's registered with a specific state. Maybe you have a website created, you might have contracts with customers, and you've acquired any specific business licenses that are required to run the business. The sixth requirement, you must be coming to the US to solely develop and direct the E2 enterprise. So this means a few things. First of all, if you're coming to the US on an E2 visa, you're not allowed, if on an E2 investor visa, as the primary investor, as opposed to a dependent spouse or child. If you're coming as the E2 investor, you need to be coming to specifically work for the E2 business. You can't work for another enterprise that is not part of the E2 business. And it needs to be your job to develop and direct the business. You need to be actively engaged in the business. It cannot be passive. And we'll talk about that as well in a few slides. Finally, you need to have the intent to return home upon the expiration of your visa. The E2 visa is a non-immigrant visa, meaning that it is not a green card. It does not lead to permanent residency nor citizenship. You need to have the intent that upon your entry on the E2 visa, you expect to leave the country and do not plan to apply for a green card during your visit. So let's get into a little more detail on these requirements. As I mentioned before, the E2 treaty investor visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows nationals of countries with an E2 treaty with the US to develop and direct the operations of an enterprise in which they have invested. There are I like to think of 3 main categories or pathways that people follow to kind of acquire that business interest. The first is people will start their own business. Our firm is a good example of that. Ian, who introduced the presentation and will be speaking again in a moment, started this business from scratch. It's a startup. So that is one way that you can generate a business or create a business that satisfies the E2 visa requirement. Another option, you can purchase an existing business. There are many business brokers. If you find, say, a convenience store, and you can purchase that business entity, it might already come with workers. That is a viable pathway to an E2 visa. Finally, franchises are quite common. So you can enter into an agreement with a franchisor to start really most any kind of franchise, as long as it's legal, per federal law. So no cannabis companies just yet, but as long as the business is legal. So for example, a Subway sandwich shop, that is also a viable pathway to an E2 visa, is to start and build that franchise. I already talked a bit about how there must be a treaty between the US and the foreign country. You can find that list on the US Department of State's website. And the final bullet here, for how long is my E2 visa valid? So this will depend on the actual agreement that the US has with the treaty country. And there is this concept of reciprocity. So some countries limit the amount of time and the US would reciprocate, or perhaps the US government has its own reasons for limiting the amount of time. We see that most E2 visas are issued for 5 years, which grants the individual over a 5-year period the ability to enter and exit the US multiple times. There's really no limit to the number of times you can enter and exit the US as long as the visa is valid. Some countries have a much shorter period. The shortest period of time is 3 months for the visa. Now, regardless of whether your visa is issued for 3 months or 5 years, each time you enter the US, you are typically granted 2 years of status to remain in the US in E2 status. So 2 years to be in the US to grow your business and develop it. If you know, and then that's assuming that your passport is valid. If your passport is valid for less than 2 years, usually your status is shortened by that amount of time. So you want to be mindful. If you have a 3-month visa, you can enter the US for 2 years, but if you leave and your visa is expired, you won't be able to come back again. You'll need to reapply for the visa. So let's turn to how much investment is enough. This is a very common question. And frankly, in our conversations with clients, it is much of what we discuss with our clients in helping them prepare to apply for an E2 visa. The government does not set a clear dollar amount. The government doesn't say if you invest $100,000, you've satisfied the investment amount. That's not the way it works. The government instead says that the investment amount must be substantial. And so in figuring out how much investment is enough, the question is the investment amount substantial? A substantial investment amount is really the amount that's necessary to make your specific type of business operational. So it really does depend on the type of business. We like to use and the government uses what's called a proportionality test. And this would be if you're creating a startup. So the question is, how much have you invested? And how much is actually necessary to make this business operational? And you need to invest really about the amount that's necessary to make the business operational, maybe just a little bit less if there are certain things that you'll be spending money on in the immediate future as soon as you get your visa. But really, we try to push our clients to invest everything you can possibly invest in the business before you get the visa. Just as an example, a manufacturing company, we have clients who manufacture actually some fascinating products, but let's take a theoretical. Let's say that someone's starting an E2 business to develop a new battery for electric vehicles. That is going to require a lot of funds. Research and development, actually buying the machinery to create these batteries. So if the government sees that you've invested $100,000 into a business that's going to create batteries, they may well say, we actually think you need to invest more into this business before that business is viable. So manufacturing might have a higher investment amount that would be deemed substantial. In contrast to, say, our law firm does not actually require a lot of money. It requires some computers, an office space, setting up the business fees. Our business, you may be able to create a law firm or a basic consulting business for $50,000. So you see there how the government, the substantial test or the proportionality test, may see that a law firm or a consulting firm actually can be viable at $50,000. A manufacturing company may need several $100,000. So it really does depend on the type of business in determining how much investment amount is sufficient. And again, that's for a startup. When you are purchasing a business, it's a different calculus. It's a different way of thinking about it. Really what the government is going to want to see is that the transaction was at what's called an arm's length. That, this was not an inside deal. This was not, say, a family member selling a convenience store for cheap to another family member. The government will want to see, actually, if you're selling a convenience store or purchasing one, that this was a business that was on the open market, that actually other people had the opportunity to buy it, and that as a result of it being on the market, and a price was paid for it on the open market, that price essentially by definition is the fair market value. So if you're purchasing a business, that is what's important there. Now, of course, the government will also want this is a consular officer who's thinking about it. So if they see that an unusually low amount was paid for a business, it could well be a flag. Or if a huge amount was paid for a business and that stands out, that could also be a flag. So, it should be a reasonable amount. Of course, keep in mind that this is a human being who's evaluating this. So whatever questions you might find are reasonable to ask about the price paid, a consular officer may well ask. So I will turn it over to Ian now to talk a bit about strategies to deal with a low dollar amount.
Perfect. No, thank you very much, Dustin. And a couple of things I wanted to touch on, and really just because these particular things have come up in the last year and a half or so, in particular with COVID. And I think one of the things that Dustin mentioned with respect to how long an E2 visa is issued for, and if your E2 visa is issued for 5 years, and as Dustin said, when you come in, if there's one thing that when you get your E2 visa, if there's one thing you should if the only thing you walk away with from this webinar is this piece of knowledge, it could save you a lot of trouble. In that, even though your visa is valid for 5 years, that is not what governs your stay in the U.S. What governs your stay in the U.S. is the 2 years that you're admitted for. And when even if your visa is valid for 5 years, when you're admitted for 2 years, you have to leave and re-enter. As long as you have a valid visa, you can leave, re-enter the same day. But we've just had a number of consults lately where people have had, not our clients, but people who've had E2 visas and didn't realize that they had to leave in the 2-year period. And it creates a significant problem, because if you're here for 6 months over that 2 years, there's a 3-year bar, which is, it's automatic. And if you're there for over 6 months, it's for over 1 year, it's a 10-year bar. So it really creates a problem. The other thing I wanted to touch on is a couple of the questions that have come in, that really some of the areas Dustin was focusing on. So I think it's probably good to touch on those right now. So, one of the questions just has to do with residency, and what's required for the E2 visa in terms of nationality, rather. So the question is, can an Indian-born Canadian citizen apply for an E2? So the answer is absolutely yes. So the E2 visa is based on your passport, not where you're born. There are many green cards that are based on where you're born in terms of when you're calculating the numbers of availability, but E2 visas are based on the actual passport that you have. So that's what guides, not permanent residence in the country, but actual citizenship and passport in the country. The second part of this question is, can we get an E2 visa to start a bookkeeping, accounting, tax preparation business? Well, the clear answer to that is yes. So we're a law firm, a service-oriented business. We often do E2 visas for service-oriented businesses. And part of this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the issues that come up with service-oriented businesses. Another question that was interesting, as Dustin just went over the low investment amount, or the requirements for the investment amount. And the question is, we are an HR consultancy looking to do an E2 move to the US from the UK. He spoke to another attorney who said they wouldn't even put an application in unless they had physically spent at least $70,000, which is difficult for a consultancy to do. So it's a good thing. I mean, I did my own application when I started my company, but it's a good thing I didn't go to this lawyer, because this lawyer wouldn't have filed my case, because I spent $15,000 and put $35,000 in a business bank account, and my case was approved. So now I think that, Dustin, when he went over this, he used the number of $50,000 even for a service-oriented business. And I think that that's right. I think that my case, there were lots of, and part of what one of the points that we're trying to get across with respect to low investment amounts or investment amounts is that your investment amount is one part of your application, right? So when you're looking at the investment amount, and you are trying to come up with a number, you can never look at that number in isolation. So you're always going to be looking at the other factors in the application. So for example, does the company already have employees? What is the person's background? So for example, when I submitted my application, the examiner really liked my background, the fact that I went to Harvard Law School, the fact that I had a lot of business experience, the fact that I wrote a book. They liked that background and thought that with that background, I would be able to attract clients, even though when I applied, I didn't have any. The other kind of thing that helps investment amount is if you have letters of intent or contracts that show that you are going to be able to attract clients. Sometimes we'll get clients to go to their local chamber of commerce, and the local chamber of commerce may look at their business plan and may write a letter that indicates that the individual will uh, assist with the creation of jobs, and that those are very, very helpful for an E2 visa, because it's saying to an examiner that an independent third party has looked at this person's case and they believe that it's going to benefit the U.S. economy. Because when we look at the investment amount, what the investment amount is trying to do, it is a proxy for the examiner to see and assess whether or not that investment ultimately will create U.S. jobs. So that's what they're attempting to do. So as I said before as well, if you already have if you have employees already, then that goes a long way. We did an E2 case relatively recently, where the person spent around $25,000 and had another $20,000 or $25,000 in a business bank account. And that person, I never for 1 minute thought that it wouldn't be approved. It was an excellent case. It was a case where she was someone who was providing kind of clinical services to a neurological disorder that was fairly common. She already had a number of government contracts in place that showed she was going to have significant revenues over time. Everyone, as the examiner, it's not hard for an examiner to kind of understand that when they go into a doctor's office, that the doctor's office often has employees working there. So it was a strong case. So there was the need for a much higher investment amount wasn't required in that particular case, because she had a lot of other factors that were quite compelling. Another important part of kind of dealing with low investment amounts is a business plan. So if your business plan is strong and credible and makes sense and something that an examiner can understand, that is going to help with your is going to help with your application as well. So with respect to the question about the $70,000, I mean, I think that that's one of the differences between our firm and some other firms that do E2s, is they're just not used to dealing with clients that have lower investment amounts. And I'd say almost we specialize in it. We focus on it, and primarily because the first case that this particular firm ever filed was our own with a low investment amount. So it can be done, and I think that many lawyers are just not used to it. The other thing that you do have to kind of look at when you are applying for an E2 visa is when it comes to lower investment amount, is where are you applying, right? So that makes a significant difference as well. If you're applying, for example, if you're going to the U.S. consulate in Paris, they may laugh you out of the consulate if you don't have over $100,000 spent. Whereas if you're going to London, if you're going to Toronto, if you're going to many other consulates, certainly a lower investment amount for a service-oriented business is completely fine. And similarly, if we're going to talk about this a little bit later, is if you're applying through USCIS, then the investment amount can even be lower. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, the pros and cons associated with that. But the investment amount can even be lower, can lower that. So let's look at these two examples. Okay, you're opening a business and the investment amount is low. However, you've already hired 2 employees and the business has already started taking in revenue, and you already have around 10 clients. So let's say you've only invested $20,000, and this was your fact pattern. This would be an excellent E2 visa case with a very, very low investment amount. It would be an excellent E2 visa case. Let's look at another. You're applying for an E2 visa and your investment amount is low. You don't want to invest any more money. That's a lot of our clients say that, and you don't want to hire anyone until the E2 visa is approved and you come to the US. Well, that might be a case where you can certainly apply, and we've had situations. There's one client I recall in Rome, where they'd invested $15,000. They put 35,000 in a business bank account. We pushed, asking them to spend more, and they said no, no, no. And lo and behold, they were actually approved. So it's but what I think that the key takeaway is that when you have a lower investment amount and you have risk or any risk factors in your case, and you're not willing to change them or unable to change them, because it could just be that you don't have the money to spend more money, then you're applying it. It's a riskier case, right? Like the E2 visas. When we look at E2 visas and we look at approval rates, our approval rate is 98% range, but past results don't predict future outcome. But even the government approval rate, though, and those are some people who file on their own and some people who file with lawyers who don't know what they're doing, et cetera. But the government approval rate is over 80% for E2 visas. So E2 visas are not they're not visas that the government is looking to deny. They're visas where, with support and a strong case, they're reasonable visas to get approved.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian. So let me quickly, I was answering a few of the questions by text. This is a great participation on the webinar today. So we're getting a number of questions, and I just want to make sure we're able to get through them. Perfect. So please do continue to send in those questions, and Ian and I will either answer them live or we'll type the answers as we go. And we will be saving a few for the end as well. But thank you all for sending those in. All right, so let's speak a little bit about common E2 visa expenditures. So as we discussed before, the government is going to want to see, going back to this investment requirement, that the investor needs to have actually invested funds, actually spent funds on the E2 business before they apply for the visa. What are the things that investors will typically spend their money on? As a broad point of guidance, again, you want to spend money on the things that are necessary to make the business operational. And if you have not spent money on a fundamental piece of the business, there's a good chance that the consular officer will notice that. So for example, if your business does not actually have an office space, if you haven't spent money on office space, there is a good chance that the consular officer will ask you, okay, where will your business be? And do you have a lease yet? And if the answer is no, they will likely ask why not. And it's possible to explain that. So that's not, that's not an immediate denial, but it is something that should be anticipated. So I think that's a helpful way to think about all of these expenses, is to think, well, if I show up in front of a consular officer, what are the things that would be expected that to run this business I would need to buy? So let's look at a few of the common things. A website, very common. Most businesses are going to need a website, and they're important because websites are essential to get more customers, right? Having an online presence is important these days. So spending money on creating a website is a very common expense. Spending money on computers or any other computer equipment is also similarly something that most any business these days will need. If you are a business or you're starting a business that will be selling products such as, let's say, a coffee roaster, spending money on coffee beans could be an important investment. Now, granted, obviously you're the expert on your business. So if it doesn't make sense to buy, say coffee beans. Say coffee beans are going to possibly expire by the time you get your visa. That's reasonable to keep in mind. But if your business does need inventory and it makes sense to buy that inventory before you have your visa, you should do that. Furniture, very common business expense. Let's skip a few because some of these are actually less common. Something very important, employee payroll or independent contractor payments. Again, this is not something that's necessarily required, is to spend money on employees or independent contractors before you apply for your visa. But if you are able to do that, that can be a very beneficial thing to show in your application. The reason being is that the consular officer, the basic and most fundamental question that they have about your business is this a business that's likely to employ US workers? And if you can show that you are already employing US workers before you've even applied for your visa, that is a very powerful thing to show them, because as we like to say, the proof is in the pudding. You can already show, consular officer, you don't need to wonder whether my business is going to hire people because I'm already doing it. Now, I saw a question come in about, well, how do you do that before you even have a visa? It's a great question, but it is certainly possible. You do not actually need to be inside of the US to say, open a business. You can create a business from abroad. You can register it in any of the states. And once you've registered the business, some banks will allow you to open a business bank account from abroad. Many landlords will allow you to enter into a lease agreement from abroad. If you face difficulties, you might actually hire someone in the US from abroad to do those things for you, to hire a business manager, an office manager early on. You can be abroad, hire an office manager located in the United States who might help you do some of these things. So you can actually set up some of these pieces without actually being inside the US, but keep in mind that many countries are on the visa waiver program. So traveling to the US either on ESTA or on a B1 visa is perfectly acceptable to set up a business. So you can come, we actually have a blog post that we'll include in the chat. I'll include it right now. And this blog post is a great one because it walks through what business activities are actually permissible on a B1 visa. A B1 visa, which is a visitor visa for business activities, allows you to do things like setting up a business, like meeting with potential business partners, like looking at office spaces and entering into a commercial lease, like setting up a bank account. So you can do a lot of those things on a temporary B1 visa. Use all of that evidence when you file your E2 visa, and that strengthens your application to use a B1 or ESTA to set up those pieces. So let's turn to other common expenses. Legal fees, very common. Fees you spend to either set up the business or prepare for the visa. As I mentioned before, a lease, very, very common and also quite important to show that you actually have a space. A brief side note, having an office space is not technically required for an E2 visa, and the government is explicit about that. You do not actually need a lease to be approved for an E2 visa. In fact, you don't even technically need an office space, but we always recommend that our clients do secure an office space because it shows to an officer that you're serious about the business, and it shows to the officer that you're actually anticipating having a space to employ people. And it reduces the likelihood that the officer will be skeptical that this will be a successful business. I'll skim through a few of these. We can spend a lot of time talking about these. Licensing fees we talked about briefly before. You want to have any licenses in place that are required for the business. If you're starting, say, a bar, you want to show that you have a liquor license and that you're not going to get your visa and be waiting in the US for months before you're able to open the business because you're waiting on a liquor license. And let's skip to the bottom. Advertising. Similar to a website, you want to show the officer that you've spent money on generating interest in your business. Let's quickly take some time to look at good versus weak expenditures. So, there are things that people spend money on for their business that we would not include. These include travel. So let's say you do get that B1 visa, you get a flight to the US, you rent a car and you spend time looking at businesses. We would not include those fees in the application. And the reason being is, again, it's always helpful to think about how a consular officer will look at these expenses. What they're really wanting to see is that you've spent money in the business itself, not that you've spent money trying to figure out what business you want. They want to see money that's actually going into something that will generate revenue and will hire workers. So along the same lines, we would not include travel accommodations. We would not include meals that you're eating while you're visiting the US to scope out business opportunities. Expenses that are reimbursed by a client or customer. Again, the government wants to see what you have committed, what funds you have committed to the business, not funds that have been reimbursed to you. And expenses paid to related parties. So for example, if you have a brother-in-law who lives in the US who has an office, and you are renting an office from the brother-in-law for your business, that could work, but would very likely raise questions. And you just want to be aware of that. The government's going to want to see that this is a legitimate business where, again, funds are committed, funds are not going to be brought back into the investor's pocket once the visa is approved. So the more you can show that all of your business interactions are, again, at an arm's length and not, family members, for example, a related party, the better. So you want to do everything at an arm's length. All right, so I am going to pass it again off to Ian to talk about some common challenges that are specific to consulting businesses.
Perfect, perfect. And some of these we have been talking about, we talked about earlier, but just to touch on, consulting businesses don't require a lot of investment. But I think that one of the things that we often hear is, well, my consulting business, I can get it started for $5,000 and that's all I need. So that should be enough, right? And unfortunately it's not. Like, so with a consulting business, the example that I used even for myself, that's not common, right? So normally if someone came to us and said that, okay, well, I only want to spend $15,000 and put some money in a business bank account, we would say yes, we can do it. However, there is a fair amount of risk associated with that petition. And I think that it's important for everyone to realize that risk means the chance of denial. It's not just a generic term that doesn't mean anything. It means that when we say something is risky, we mean that it has a high or risk of denial, right? So I think that, so even though consulting businesses, everyone should know, I know, Dustin knows, the examiner probably knows that people could, I started my business, I could have just had a laptop and worked from home. But when I started my business, I signed a 1-year lease. It was $1,750 a month, and I didn't have any clients. I didn't need it at all, but I felt I had to spend some money. I spent that was 3,000 of the 15,000 I spent because it was, or 3,200, because 3,400 rather, because I had security deposit and first month's rent that I paid. But I felt it was necessary because I had to spend something, because I knew I couldn't just roll up with $5,000 spent and ask for the visa, because it probably would have been denied. So I think that the other thing with respect to consulting businesses is, we had one gentleman, he was a Canadian, and he went to the consulate, and I think the consulate didn't approve his application, and primarily because I think that they thought he would have a difficult time consulting. Yet this person had a lot of difficulty kind of conveying simple concepts, and the consulate probably thought that he wouldn't be able to successfully operate the business, and didn't approve the person. In this similar case, something like that happened in London once as well. I remember this particular gentleman had a lot of anxiety issues, and just really, I think, had a really tough time at the interview, because the interview is very important, and they're going to look to see, well, look at what the person's doing, and conclude as to whether or not they think that the person is going to be able to do it. And yeah, and I think that I think that, like, as Dustin had mentioned, the person behind the counter is just a human being, and they're making that determination as to, because often with consulting businesses, the businesses don't have a lot of track record in the US yet. They don't have as many clients, and the investment amount is low, so the officer is making a determination. So anything you can do to bolster that is helpful. And then, I think Justin already talked about a lot of the different things that you can spend money on related to consulting business. But a few of those are listed here. A lot of the time, people will prepay rent to kind of get the investment amount up. We've had people that have purchased more equipment than probably they needed to get the investment amount up. But the investment amount can only be things that you've actually spent money on, right? So if you have a lease for a year, you can't include the rental amounts for the year. You can only include the amounts that you've actually paid. Like, so if you actually do prepay it, then you can include all of that. So So, the other kind of, when we look at risky businesses, first we just talked about consulting businesses, and they're risky because usually the investment amount is low, right? So that's generally the reason they're risky. Another very high risk E2 area is real estate investments. Now, a couple of examples. So we had a gentleman who he used another lawyer. He went to the U.S. consulate in Frankfurt. He bought one house, which I believe had a mortgage on it, but he bought one house and said that he was, going to do, he maybe spent $500,000 on that house and had a mortgage. And he said that he was going to do a home flipping business. He went to the consulate and was denied, and then he came to us, and we repositioned the file a little bit so that he was doing more of a home renovation business. But a home flipping business is possible for E2 visas, but it can't be. E2 visas do require that you hire employees, and that it's an active business, not a passive business. And I think that the reason real estate sometimes gets a bad rap when it comes to E2 visas is that they are viewed as passive. That someone buys a house, they make some do some renovations, and then they flip it, and then they buy another house, do some renovations, and they flip it. And that in itself is not creating employment in a really business sense. It's more they see it almost as a relatively passive investment, and one that isn't necessarily going to require hiring employees. The other thing with respect to this particular type of business is it does require, if you we've done house flipping businesses for E2s, but it normally requires that the individual has a number of properties, right? So then that means that the investment amount is significant, and the properties can't have mortgages on them. There's another rule or provision that we're dealing with that says that the investment can't, you can have a loan, but the security can't be the business. And in this case, if the assets of the business are the security, it wouldn't work. So real estate businesses can be done, but I think that what you have to do is make sure that you are showing them as real and operating businesses rather than kind of passive or speculative businesses where you're just kind of looking for appreciation in property. We have done, the other kind of real estate business, we've done E2s for people who have opened brokerage firms. So that's, the real estate agents. That's not a problem at all. We've done E2 visas for people who have done um, real estate management companies, like, whether it's property management. So they're collecting rents and things like that. But again, those are cases where they have a lot of properties and they can demonstrate that, they need someone that is collecting the rents. They need someone who's, performing repairs on the properties. They need people, or they need staff to be able to actively work at the business. We have E2 visas as well, where we have one where the individual, he provides services to people who own houses, and the people rent out the houses to Airbnb. He's in Hawaii. And his company provides all of the services that those Airbnb houses need. So his employees are cleaners, his employees are maintenance people, his employees are the kind of porters, or people who meet the people to let them in, different things like that. And that was definitely a workable model. And we talked about house flipping. It can work as long as it's on a large scale. So another risky E2 area is when your E2 visa involves any type of equity trading. So a few things to consider here. So one is that if you put your own money in a portfolio and say you're going to trade it, and these questions come up all the time, right? So these aren't just made up scenarios. Like, someone's, I have $1 million, I want to put it in a bank, and I want to be a day trader. Can I get an E2 visa for that? So the answer is no. So the first thing with respect to trading is that you have to be managing other people's money, right? Because I think that trading does suffer a little bit the same way that real estate does, where initially an examiner just thinks this is a passive form of investment, and as a result of that, they don't want to approve it. But they can be, we've done E2 visas for hedge funds, and we've done E2 visas for people who are managing other people's money. And I think that it's good if they're managing other people's money that is not their family's money as well. Like, maybe if it's a combination of your family's money and other people's money, that could work. However, the more that it is other people's money, that's definitely much better. The other thing to kind of look at is, this is one area where they will, when you go to the consulate or you apply through USCIS, they will almost certainly ask you for the licenses and make sure that you have completed all of the regulatory requirements. Because if you're trading your own money, there are no requirements. You don't need a license or anything to do that. But if you're trading other people's money, then the SEC is involved, and there are all sorts of requirements and licenses that have to be fulfilled. So very, definitely a highly regulated area. So definitely doable, and we've done a number of them, but it's definitely, it's an area again that you have to make sure that you are providing the government with documentation to show that this particular business will ultimately require US workers to execute it. So now let's look at some okay. So now let's look at some adjudication trends. Now let's look at some adjudication trends and talk about them. So the Biden administration, has been in power for about a year now. So kind of the question that comes up is, have the E2 visa approval rates changed? And the answer really is no. I'd say they haven't. I'd say that, one thing, even with the last administration, is that we didn't really see a significant change in the approval of E2 rates of E2 visas. And, so that, and I think that's, I think that's really a good thing. But the rates still, they do post historical rates, and they've traditionally hovered around the 80% range. So which is not bad at all. The one kind of problem with this year, obviously, has been processing time. So, and that's really a function of COVID, and that, consulates are opening up. So we see, Toronto's open up, we see London's opening up, we see even Buenos Aires just recently opened up. So we definitely are seeing consulates starting to open up, but the problem is that it's still slow. It's definitely still it's still slower than it was before. So I think that that trend, as COVID improves, we'll see, improvement, but I think it's still, still a long way to go. When we look at Toronto, we'd still be, if we filed today, we'd still be looking at probably 6 months before an interview. If we were looking at London, we'd probably be looking at 6 months before an interview. And, they're both consulates, or many consulates, have mechanisms to try and get faster appointments, but it is quite a process. Baja, it's Buy American, Hire American. This is something that was introduced in the old administration. I'd say that there's still a little bit of that, but definitely not as much of a focus. I'd say this is one of the big changes during the last administration, is that for example, if you're trying to bring in a need to employee, or if when you were making your investment, they would focus on the investment being made in the US. The regulations are clear that the investment can be made outside of the US, but I think that the last administration would ask that often, like, where was the investment made, and focus on that. I think generally speaking, though, I think it's stronger case when your investment is made in the US. So I think it's something to keep in mind. And in terms of, we talked about the second bullet point, but consulates processing E2 visas, and they are. So it's just you do have to check ahead. You have to, if you're eligible to apply in more than one place, you have to, we looked, and we'd see, whether or not which consulate is the one that is best positioned to take your case. So, and I think the last bullet point's not applicable anymore. So we'll move on to the next slide. Okay. So these are just some questions that and issues that come up when we're dealing with E2 visas. So the first question is, do you have to hire employees before you apply for an E2 visa? So the answer is no, you don't. However, it improves your case if you do. So, as we said before, the investment amount is a proxy for E2 visas, and the investment amount is a proxy for employees. And so if you already have employees, then when we're looking at the investment amount becomes less important. So I think that having employees, it definitely makes a much stronger application. But I'd say that the majority of startups that we do don't have employees when we first apply, but it definitely makes for a stronger application. The other kind of issue that sometimes comes up, and this at times comes up at consulates, but depending on the consulate, but always comes up if you're filing within the United States, and that's a source of funds. So the source of funds, so, like, for the purposes of this example, I'll just assume that you're like someone's filing within the United States. They really take a look, and this is a requirement that says the money has to come from a legitimate source. And when with this particular one, they really look at the documents in excruciating detail. So if you say that the money came from savings, if we were doing a consulate, we probably would just provide some information on tax returns. But if we were doing USCIS filing, we'd have to provide the tax returns, but then we'd also have to provide bank statements to show accumulation of the funds over time, and then the money coming out from that particular account. So I think that that's it's just much more complex. But source of funds is a requirement for E2, but we tend to go in very light with consulates, but it's much heavier with USCIS filings. E2 visas for two investors. So definitely, a lot of the time the question comes up, do I need 50% or 51%? The absolute answer is 50%. It's not 51. And two people can get, this question came up in a forum just the other day. If, let's say someone's from France and someone's from the UK, they can both get E2 visas. If they, both are 50% owner of the company and they both are investors, they can both get E2 visas. So that's not a problem at all. The other big question that comes up with people who have an E2 visa, so let's say someone comes to the United States and opens a restaurant, and then they decide that they don't want to run the restaurant anymore, and they shut the restaurant down, but they still have the LLC, and then they want to now do a service-oriented business, and what do you do? So it is a complicated area, and depending on how substantive the change is, that would necessitate something being done. But generally speaking, you're given the visa to do what you said that you were going to do. If the change isn't substantive or significant, then that's fine. You can do everything still under the legal entity. But if it is substantive, then it does require some additional filings and or assessment as to whether or not you're still eligible for the E2. And Dustin talked about family-based purchases a lot, so I'm not going to revisit that. But if you're buying a company and you're buying it from your family member, the government can be quite critical, and this can be a really high-risk area with E2 visa cases. We just recently had a case where someone applied in Australia, and we warned them that this could be a big issue because they purchased a company from their brother or sister, I can't remember which one. And then it was approved, and then 4 years later, they went back to renew, and it was when they renewed that they raised the issue about the purchase that happened 4 years ago, and said that they didn't believe it was a legitimate purchase and didn't approve the visa. So it really can be an issue when you're buying from family members. And as Dustin said, you really have to, if you are buying from family members, you have to substantiate where the money came from, and also that you paid a price that was the fair market value of the company.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian. So we have just a couple minutes left for questions.
Oh, no, we have still a quarter after, Dustin, so we have to.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, perfect. So that's good because we actually have, like I said, strong participation today, and the questions have been excellent. Like I mentioned before, I have been typing answers to some of the questions, so make sure to click your question and answer box to see some of the great questions that have come up and the responses to those. A few of the questions that we have not yet addressed, I've noticed, and I wanted to answer this live. There have been a few questions about changing status. So can you apply for E2 status if you're already within the United States? The answer to that is yes. You can certainly apply to change your status from within the US. If you're here, whether you're here on, say, a B1 visa or an F1 student visa, a TN visa, you can apply to USCIS with your full E2 application and ask to change your status to E2 status. And USCIS does offer an expedited option. I think the current fee is about $2,500 per applicant, but if you pay that to USCIS, they will guarantee you a decision within 15 calendar days, which is quite amazing. The thing to keep in mind with that is that a decision could be a request for additional evidence. Some people aren't aware of that. So a decision could be an approval, a denial, or a request for additional evidence. And if you do get a request for additional evidence, the government would have an additional 15 calendar days from the date you give them a response to that request. But still, it's far better than typical processing fee times at USCIS, which right now, if you don't apply for premium processing, I'll put the link to the government's website on processing times, but processing times could go into 9 months to a year for USCIS to reach a decision on your application. So right now in the chat, I am sharing the link to see USCIS's published processing times. Yeah,
And
go ahead.
Dustin, why don't we, because what we can do is, because we just have a little bit of time, we can just, because for the recording, we can just run through, I can just run through the questions as well.
Sure.
So that, and then, yeah, and then everyone can hear them if they have an interest. So, one question is, does e-commerce business qualify for E2? So yes, any business qualifies for E2 as long as you meet the requirements that Dustin went over at the beginning, and we've done many e-commerce businesses, so that's fine. We answered the next question already related to 70,000. Can E2 visa holders recruit employees from other countries like British citizens? So yes, sorry, no. So I'm not sure 100% I understand the question, but let me briefly talk about E2 visa employees. So when you get an E2 visa, let's say you are a UK national and you get an E2 investor visa, you're permitted to bring E2 employees if they are UK nationals in this particular case, that are managers, executives, or specialists. So if in terms of recruiting employees from other countries, you can certainly recruit them from other countries if they are the same nationality under an E2, and you can recruit them from other countries if there's another visa category available to them, like a TN or H1B or whatever category is available. And what's the minimum salary of an investor what's the minimum salary an investor must earn to number? Okay, so there's no minimum salary. You basically want to make sure that the investor is able to support themselves. To the number of employees at the beginning, we talked about that, often none, but definitely beneficial to have many or some. Paris Embassy is a very conservative consulate. What do you need to address specifically? So, I think that's probably just too, I look on their website to see what their requirements are in terms of what it is they want, but I agree they are a conservative consulate and not an easy E2 consulate for high risk cases. They definitely prefer cases that are, multinationals and larger entities, or buying a business. So they are definitely much more difficult for service oriented businesses. But I'd say generally speaking, the many of the things we went over in the webinar, those are things that you would want to do if you wanted to apply there. We formed the USA LLC already and paid for that to happen in the state of Illinois. I should note that we have 2 UK businesses. Okay, so this is kind of going on for a bit. Yeah, I'm not sure if that relates to a different question or not, but I don't see a specific question in there. Can we buy an existing restaurant business in the US from Canada? Yes, of course. Yeah, so just Dustin had gone through in the presentation. Either it's buy a business, start a franchise, all good for E2. Yes, the recording will be available. Dustin just went over the changing of status question. Another question about restaurants, which is great. Just hiring someone in the US part-time count? Yeah, you can hire people full-time, part-time, it doesn't matter. The idea is that if, when Dustin used the number of 3 to 5, he's talking about full-time equivalents. So if you have 6 part-time people that are working 20 hours, that would be the equivalent of 3 full-time people. So can an Indian advocate start a legal professional services firm independently or join as partners of a US law firm if it's open like any other business? Unfortunately, I don't understand the question, so I will have to move to the next one. If you have property, I can use office space. Not really sure what that's referring to. Tourist visas can be granted for 10 years without restriction, 6 months continuous stay, or is that an answer? Yeah, maybe that's an answer, right? Is that...
No, yeah, Ian, I think it's just asking where the 2-year limit comes from, and that's just regulation.
Yeah, the regulation. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's a whole table. It's called a reciprocity table, where you can look up how long visas are issued for by country. Okay, so I think that might be no, no. Can interview time be sped up if you're applying within the U.S.? Justin answered that. You can, yeah, you can spend $2,500 to do that. But as Justin mentioned, if you do pre-processing in the U.S. and you leave the U.S. and you re-enter, you need a visa to re-enter. Because I think some of these are building on other questions, so they're not as easy to follow. Okay, perfect. That's answered. Oh yeah, you answered that already. Just okay. The
Yeah,
typical
sorry, Ian.
pre-meeting
I
process.
was I was actively engaging in in the chat because I thought we only had a couple minutes.
No problem. No
But I'm
problem.
happy to, Ian, I'm happy to highlight the questions that I think we have not answered
Oh yeah,
yet.
that sounds good. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, yeah.
So I think so an important question. Someone asked, how do we engage further with you guys? I put the link in our chat to schedule a consultation with us. Okay, so there's a question here in the chat. What about hiring a consultant where you would have an agreement with them if they were not a full-time employee? Ian, I don't know if you want to respond to that. It's just, you know, Ian referred to this before, where he said that 3 to 5 is really referring to full-time equivalents. Part-time is also acknowledged by the consulate. It's not as strong as a full-time employee. And again, 3 to 5 full-time equivalents, so 40
Yeah.
hours a week. And independent contractors are also considered. But Ian, I'll if you had anything you wanted to add to
No, I
that.
think that's good. No, I think that's good. Yeah.
Okay, and then we had I'm looking at the Q&A box. We had a number of questions come in. So while you're applying for a change of status, can you have an ongoing E2 visa application in your home country? The answer is yes, absolutely. You can have a change of status application pending with USCIS, and you can file a separate application with your consulate in your home country, and can have both processes going in parallel, so that if you get called at the consulate before, great, you can get the visa and come in. And if the consulate takes a long time, you can change your status within the US in the meantime and get to work on your E2 business domestically from within the US. Can one E2 investor with 50% ownership open a company with 2 US investors? The answer is yes. As long as you own at least 50% of the business, it is perfectly fine to have a co-owner who is a US citizen, or multiple co-owners who are US citizens. The important thing is that your ownership stake cannot drop below 50%. Ian, did you see any other questions that we?
Yeah, there's one here on home renovation businesses. So would an existing home renovation business in treaty country be a good contender for an E2 visa? Years of experience, already successful in running business that does need labor. Would it require a local renovation license? So yeah, so we do a lot of home renovation businesses, and those ones we actually encourage people who initially say home flipping business to do home renovation businesses, because they're a lot easier to present and they require a lot less investment. The last part of your question though, of the licenses, yes, you need a license. Now this was fascinating because we have a home renovation guy who he was USCIS and he's only done USCIS. I think this is Dustin's case, or I think it was maybe I can't remember, but maybe Mikhail was. But he had been approved for like 2 years and another 2 years, maybe even another 2 years. And he doesn't want to leave the US, so we applied again. On the third renewal, we got a RFE with one question only: please provide your license. Right, and it was a problem because he didn't have one. So so definitely for that particular type of business, each county wants their cut. They're usually not that hard to get, but definitely you want to get the license, because it is something that could come up, but particularly USCIS. I think a consulate is not necessarily going to ask for it, but particularly USCIS.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And Ian, I was keeping my eye on a few other questions that came
Perfect.
in. I think so a couple of these are quick. The form that's used to change status to E2 is the I-129.
Yeah.
And you can use that form to check the processing times. Ian, there was a question here that I think it would be interesting to get your take on it. It's this one that's asking, to what extent can you prepare a business prior to actually getting the E2 visa? This person is licensed to practice law in the US and wants to make sure they have everything in place, or as much as they can before they apply.
Yeah, so you can you can do everything. You can get everything, you don't need if you are not in the US, you can open up a business in the US and you don't need any visa if you're not physically present in the US. So you can, like, let's say you were living in Canada and you wanted to open a business and you hired employees. That's all completely fine to do. There's no requirement to have a visa if you're not actually physically on US soil doing work. So you can do everything. You can have, you could, like, so let's take the example, let's say someone wanted to buy a 7-Eleven and they were living in Canada. They could absolutely buy that and own it for a year before they ever decide to apply for an E2 visa. They just couldn't come to the US and work at the 7-Eleven. Yeah.
Perfect. And then I've seen this question come in a couple of times. Can a Canadian enter the US on a B1, B2 visa while having a pending E2 application with the consulate? The answer is yes, you can.
Yeah, you
You
can. Yeah,
can submit an
you just
application.
have to be careful. I think you can do it, but you just have to be careful, because when you have submitted an application, you're basically saying to the government that your business is ready to go, right? Because that's when you submit an application, when your business is ready to go or up and running already. So when you enter, they may think that you're entering to work, right? Because why else would you be entering, right? You have an existing business there and they might think you're entering to work. So because you're saying to them, I'm waiting for my permission to work and you want to enter. And unless you have a very good reason for why you want to enter, they may not admit you.
Perfect. Yeah, that is key. It can be very tricky. So there were a couple questions that I think are really important to clarify. With this question is asking, how long does it take to secure an E2 visa if applied outside of the USA? That would depend on the consulate. Some consulates are much faster than others, and it really does span from 3 weeks to over a year. Now, the second part of the question, though, I think is critical. Would you recommend that a person enter the US as a visitor and then apply for a change of status, or apply at a consulate? And I think the really important thing to keep in mind that Ian had mentioned is that if you are applying for a change of status within the US and you're approved, you do not get a visa. So as soon as you leave the US, you would need to apply for a visa at the consulate. As long as you're okay doing that, applying within the US sometimes makes sense for people, particularly during COVID. They didn't want to travel. But if it is an option for you to apply at a consulate, generally that is our recommendation. And the reason is that you actually get a visa, and it allows you to enter and exit the US multiple times. A related question to that, I think it's a great question. Do you need to apply at a consulate that's in an E2 treaty country? The answer is no. However, not all consulates will consider E2 applications, but consulates are supposed to. So for example, we did recently have an application for a UK national. The United Kingdom is an E2 treaty country, but this person was living in Vietnam, and Vietnam is not an E2 treaty country, but the Vietnam embassy had absolutely no problem processing the E2 visa, actually in record time. So you do want to check with the embassy beforehand, but many consulates and embassies that are not in E2 treaty countries will process E2 applications. Ian, did you see any other questions?
No, I think can I start a consultancy and initially subcontract to brother-in-law in the same field going rate? Don't fully understand the question. I think that I don't fully understand the question, but the E2, like when you're looking at the E2 visa requirements, if that's what it relates to, starting a consultancy and getting an E2, then you have to meet the E2 visa requirements. And Dustin and I spent a lot of time talking about arm's length, and brother-in-law is not arm's length, right? So that's relative. So depending on what the relationship is, that is what is going to govern whether or not it's a successful E2. But it's a relationship with where the money came from, whether the investment was actually made, all of those different things that would come into play.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Great. I think
Yeah,
we're at
at time.
10:15, and
Yes,
again,
exactly.
Great participation on this webinar. Really, thank you all for the great questions. Ian, thank you for taking the time and sharing your expertise. Again, congratulations on the 10 years. For anyone who is interested in speaking with us further about your specific plans, please do visit our website. We have a link where you can schedule a consultation. You can schedule it for as little as 30 minutes, and we'll get into the details of what your business idea is, where you are in the process, and give you specific guidance on your circumstances, which is really much more valuable than general guidance that we can provide in this webinar. But again, thank you all. Ian, thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone, stay healthy and well. Thank you.